Welcome to the Future of Structures podcast, where we talk to the experts who are evolving our buildings for tomorrow. And here is your host, Adam Jones.
Today we are speaking with Chris Nunn, who is the Head of Sustainability at EMP Capital. So they have a real estate portfolio over $23 billion, and Chris is also the Chair of the Australian Passiv Haus Association. So at times it might seem like a really long journey to becoming carbon neutral with our buildings. But with solid leadership from investment firms like Chris Nunn is at EMP Capital, there is a lot of good reasons to be optimistic that we can really get there. So in this episode, I discussed with Chris the opportunities with passive house design, something he is obviously very knowledgeable and very passionate about. Also, how our building code can be best improved and where Australia is relative to the rest of the world. So Chris is an extremely passionate and well-articulated person on the topic of sustainability, and you can actually go and meet him if you want at the Australian Passiv Haus Conference, which is between the 3rd and 7th of May, actually in Melbourne. So if you're in Melbourne or if you're from Melbourne, go and get down there, and the link is in the show notes. So I hope you guys enjoy listening to Chris as much as I did speaking to him. Without any further ado, here is Chris Nunn.
I think the way you've got it set up is nice, as in it gives me an opportunity to talk a bit about what we're doing at EMP Capital Real Estate. Cool. Yep. Then we can talk about the Passive House piece, which is, I think, really topical and interesting to people.
Yep.
And I've got some great content on that with case studies that I'll talk to. And then, landing with the sustainability in general, where I can talk about things like GRESB and the construction code and drivers. And I think that sort of three-part works really well.
Cool. And as I'll get stuck in a second, but as I briefly mentioned, it is easy to edit anything out. So, it's happened a few times where people didn't like the answer they gave or whatever, but, rough's also fine as well. But if there's anything you really don't like, it's easy to edit out. All
right. Good to know. Thanks.
Awesome. And I'll put a bio in later at the start, so I'll do editing for that. But if you could start the show by telling us a little bit about your career background and journey to be where you are today.
Sure. So my name's Chris Nunn. I'm the Head of Sustainability at EMP Capital Real Estate, which is the property business of EMP Capital, which is an investment management company, which has about $188 billion worth of funds under management. And the real estate component of that is about $26 billion worth of real estate in Australia.
Yep.
So we've got about 30 office buildings, 29 industrial and 30 retail buildings, so about 90 in total. And myself, as the Head of Sustainability, I've come from a pretty much sustainability background. I started as an environmental lawyer. I worked for Minter Ellison back in the 2000s, and then the Environmental Defenders Office. And then I decided I wanted to move into sustainability consulting, and I was lucky enough to win myself a scholarship to go and study in the UK. I went to the London School of Economics and did my master's in sustainability. And then out the back of that, got a job with an environmental consultancy division within a large architecture, engineering, multidisciplinary consultancy called Atkins. And Faithful & Gould is the subdivision I worked in. And worked for them for about 5 years. And then I'd met my wife and we'd got married, and so we decided to come back to Australia. So we moved back to Australia, and I took a job with Norman Disney & Young, a consulting engineering firm, and was their sustainability leader for about 3 years, and then worked for JLL, one of the largest property management companies in the world. So was their sustainability director for the Australian region, and then moved to EMP Capital in about 2015.
Yeah, amazing. That seems like a really unique background. And now at EMP Capital, what type of sustainability aspirations are you trying to bring into your investments?
So we've got a series of property funds is the way that the EMP Capital real estate business is operated and how the assets are owned. And so I set, in collaboration with the fund managers, a sustainability or ESG, environment, social governance strategy for each of the funds each year. And in some of those funds, we've got really progressive targets. For instance, the EMP Capital Wholesale Office Fund, which owns our premium office assets, has an aspiration to be zero carbon by 2030, which is a formal commitment we've made to our investors as part of our strategy, and to improve all our neighbours ratings across the portfolio to an area weighted average of 5-star by 2020 and 5.5-star by by 2030. So really pushing that energy efficiency piece.
Wow.
But then also with a renewables and electricity procurement component in order to get to zero carbon by 2030. So that's what we feel is technically and economically feasible for a large institutional property owner, is that zero carbon by 2030 at a portfolio scale is achievable.
Yep. And what about your main competitors? Are they on the same journey at the moment, or are you guys out in front with these sustainability initiatives?
I'd say we're one of a select few who's put it out there in that way and made a big zero carbon commitment. There are others who've done that, and I think all of the others are on a similar trajectory. Some are even more advanced than us, in fact, in terms of rolling out energy efficiency initiatives across their office and industrial shopping centre portfolios. So I think the Australian market generally is very competitive and very strong on sustainability. So all of the institutional real estate owners and real estate investment trusts are making, I think, really strong progress collectively on sustainability.
Yeah, awesome. And what are some of the most important sustainability initiatives you need to bring in, going more to the technical or practical side of things, to become zero carbon?
Yeah, so we actually engaged a consultant to look at this in terms of giving effect to the AWOF commitment to be zero carbon by 2030. We engaged a consultant to really work that through with us at a technical level, and we found that probably about a third of the journey is energy efficiency. Then perhaps another 40 to 50, maybe even 60% is energy procurement, so buying renewable electricity through the grid. And then the remainder is things like conversion of existing gas-fired equipment, like gas-fired hot water and domestic hot water boilers, to electric, so heat pumps, for instance. So there's an electrification component as well, which we're sort of getting started on now. That's something that I don't think people talk about very much. I mean, there's a lot of focus on neighbours and energy efficiency and LEDs and solar on site, and all of that's really important. But then there's not a lot of discussion around, well, that's only going to get you so far. You might get 30, you might get 40, you might be lucky and you might be able to get 50% energy efficiency savings, but you're probably going to be really pushing the limits of economic and technical feasibility to go beyond that. So there'll always be this residual component of emissions associated with the electricity you procure. So electricity procurement's a real focus, I think, for all of us in the property industry now. Yeah,
okay. And just quickly, with the electricity procurement, do you have much say over what you take from the grid, or what's the whole process of trying to procure renewable electricity or green electricity to your investment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think historically there's been products on the market that have been labelled green power, and that's traded at a premium to conventional electricity costs. So there's always been a product you can buy which gets you a zero carbon claim associated with the grid source electricity. However, we're starting to see the emergence of power purchase agreements, which is where large electricity buyers like us will contract directly, effectively, with a solar farm or virtually through in partnership with a retailer in order to secure renewable energy deal that is cost competitive with our current cost of electricity. So I think that's the really exciting part about electricity procurement now, is that we're starting to see opportunities to buy green power or zero carbon renewable electricity at a price which is comparable to, or perhaps even lower than, the wholesale cost of electricity through the grid, even for a large consumer like us. So that tipping point, the sort of much anticipated time when renewables becomes cheaper than fossil fuels, and we see a large scale shift in purchasing decision making away from fossil fuels into renewables, I think is tantalizingly close.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So do you see like some kind of landslide kind of movement once we pass that threshold, and then it's all of a sudden the better financial decision? Do you think it's going to go heavy in that direction pretty quickly?
I think there's no question that long-term renewables will be cheaper than fossil fuels. I think that's just an economic reality that the transition is on. There are no input costs other than the construction cost and the minor operating costs around maintenance for wind and solar. So they've got that major competitive advantage over conventional electricity sources who have a fuel cycle. So I think the basics of that are undeniable, and it's just a question of the policy settings and the grid infrastructure settings, the competitive landscape around the transmission and distribution networks and the electricity retailers that will. When is that transition going to be allowed to happen in an orderly fashion? And that's partly what's being debated by governments, state and federal at the moment, around the Finkel review and what's the future of the electricity market. So there's a lot of policy focus on what that optimal suite of policy settings should look like. But we I think in the property industry all look forward to the day when we have a greater degree of choice about electricity procurement, and we've got cheap renewable energy options open to us, and we're doing things like demand response, so that we're at times of peak grid load, we're able to feed into the grid and support the stability of the grid by applying some of our decentralized generation assets or even diesel generators or set point drift in shopping centres, applying some of those resources to help the grid stay stable. So I think there's a really exciting future for the Australian electricity market that we're just on the cusp of.
Yeah, fantastic. Very exciting. And another big part of the equation you mentioned earlier was energy efficiency. And I saw on Google, Passivhaus is... You're doing a lot of technical presentations on Passivhaus, and I think you're the head of the Australian Passiv Haus Association. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I'm currently serving in a volunteer position, above and beyond my day job as the chairperson of the Australian Passive Haus Association, which is a not-for-profit organisation to promote passive house in Australia. So passive house, as you may know, is a German, originally designed in the sort of 1990s by German building physicists and scientists as a way to effectively, in cold climates like Germany and Northern Europe, do away with a conventional heating system. What passive house was intended, how can we make a building in terms of its insulation, glazing performance, air tightness, thermal bridging, effective enough to keep it warm through the cold winter with very minimal energy inputs from, effectively doing away with a conventional, fossil fuel fired heating system. And that basic concept has evolved over the years, over the sort of 26 years that Passive House has been in operation, into a really sophisticated sustainability system for designing and construction of low energy, high indoor environmental quality, high performance buildings, basically, with the use of mechanical ventilation with heat recovery systems as one of the key technologies that continually drives fresh air through the building. Yep.
And that last one you said, the heat recovery, the heat recovery systems.
Mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. Yeah, so there's a few key technologies that underpin a passive house construction, and they are that it should be airtight. So it has typically it'll have an airtight membrane, which is a thin film, effectively a high performance textile that's applied to the inside of the building fabric, that is a breathable membrane, but that keeps conditioned air inside effectively. And then that air tightness, so you've got effectively when conditions are too hot or too cold for a natural ventilation strategy. So in a passive house, for instance, in a residential passive house, you can still open the windows, of course, on a nice day, and you can benefit from natural ventilation. But when it's either too hot or too cold, you're in heating mode or cooling mode, you shut the building, and all of the fresh air ventilation is done through what's called a mechanical ventilation with heat recovery unit. So that's effectively a pump that brings the air through a heat exchanger. That means the incoming air, say it's a hot summer's day and it's hot outside air, that hot outside air is tempered. Some of the heat is exchanged through the heat exchanger with the outgoing cooler air from inside, and so that the air is preconditioned effectively on its way in, and there's a net, a less transfer of heat energy from the inside to the outside.
Amazing.
And vice versa. So so that's the key technology, is the mechanical ventilation with heat recovery unit, and then thermal bridging as well, because the other big way that heat gets into a building in hot climates, or heat is lost from the inside of a building to the outside in cold climates, is through things like the window frames, which in Australia, might be aluminium or they might even be steel. And they sort of act as a radiator. On a hot day, if you touch the frames of your window, you might find that it's actually really hot to the touch, and that's actually heat that's coming into your conditioned environment that in a conventional house you might be dealing with an air conditioner or something. So you're applying energy to something that's it's effectively a leak of heat into the system. And so Passive House really pays a lot of attention to that detail, which is called thermal bridging, so that you have really high performance thermally broken window frames and double or even triple glazing to make sure that you're not allowing that kind of heat exchange in and out of the building when you're in cooling mode.
Yeah, amazing. That sounds like it's amazing if a lot of our houses or buildings were built that way. Is there any opportunities with the building code, or maybe perhaps start with saying where our building code is now compared to the rest of the world, and if there is opportunities to incorporate some passive house design into the code so everyone's utilising this energy efficiency?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting prospect, and it's something that we're actively talking to the Australian Building Codes Board on behalf of the Australian Passive House. We've engaged with the revisions that are proposed to the National Construction Code for 2019. So the commercial sections of the National Construction Code are being revised, and we're proposing to have the Passive House planning package, which is the software tool effectively that underpins the Passive House design process.
Wow.
Proposing to have that PHPP, Passive House Planning Package as it's known, accredited as a JV3, a verification method to comply with the building code. So people who are seeking Passive House will be able to comply with the building code using the Passive House Planning Package software tool. So that's one really exciting thing. And then I think also there's the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, ASBEC, is working on a trajectory project that looks at, well, what changes do we need to the National Construction Code between now and, say, 2050, when we know we have to be all new housing, all existing buildings need to be zero carbon. So it's looking at a series of step changes above and beyond what's happening in the 19 revisions. Say 3-year increments, you could tighten the code incrementally in 3-year cycles toward a zero carbon end goal. So there's a really interesting research project that's happening at the moment, and there's a preliminary report about that out now by Climate Works, who are the partner for ASBEC, who are delivering that work. So I think that's really interesting as a way that Passive House could be incorporated into the building code in future.
Yeah.
And I guess coming back to your first question about where are we now, well, in the National Construction Code, we don't have air tightness provisions. So there's a provision that says buildings should be sealed. However, it doesn't say to what performance standard, and there's no requirement to test. So one of the things that is a characteristic of a passive house process is that, during the construction process and when the building's finished, you do what's called an air tightness test, and you pressurize the building and determine how leaky it is, and you get a numeric value. And to achieve passive house, it has to be, a certain level of air tightness, 0.6 air changes per hour, for instance. And so you've got to achieve a really high level of air tightness to get to passive house. But I think that's what's exciting about the changes to the building code is you don't necessarily need to achieve passive house levels of air tightness to have a benefit from improved sealing in conditioned spaces, particularly residential, which we know are pretty leaky, and even commercial buildings are quite leaky in Australia. So it's really exciting to see the Australian Building Codes Board considering the introduction of mandatory air tightness testing and air tightness criteria in the building code, and I think that'd be a great step forward. Yeah.
It seems really positive, and just speaking to you now, it sounds like the people who are in charge of the building codes, they are seeming to be ambitious and are really looking to become carbon neutral. Do you think we've got a good shot at it by 2050?
Well, the changes that are happening at the moment that are being proposed for the National Construction Code revisions in 2019 is one set of policy changes. And then the ASBEC work is a sort of separate piece of advocacy work, if you like, being done by this industry association advocating for change. So at the moment, I think there is a real willingness on the part of the Australian Buildings Code Board and the COAG Energy Council to consider improved energy productivity by tightening the building code. And I think that's fantastic. And the property industry, I believe, would welcome that. Those of us who care about, moving toward a more energy efficient but also much more comfortable building fabric in Australia, really welcome these proposed changes to the construction code.
And how are we doing compared to the rest of the world in terms of our construction code compared to, say, Europe? And I think you've had a bit of time in England. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I spent 6 years working out of the London office for Atkins, and had the fortune to work in places like the Middle East, and I did an airport in Saudi Arabia as a sustainability consultant. I worked on Crossrail, which was the largest construction project in Europe at the time. Had a really great exposure to the UK and European market when I was over there. And so I think in some respects, Australia is very strong compared to the rest of the world. For instance, the main way that property portfolios in Australia are ranked for sustainability relative to property companies around the world is GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And that's a survey that institutional property owners fill out every year. It's been running since 2011. And that asks a series of questions about how sustainable you are, what policies you have in place, but also importantly, it prompts you to submit all of your energy data and water and waste consumption figures and intensity metrics. And it's a really detailed benchmarking tool around actual sustainability performance. And Australia does very well in GRESB. It's actually the region which is ranked highest relative to all the other regions around the world, including Europe and North America, which are traditionally seen as, perhaps leaders relative to Australia. So I think the institutional property owners in Australia have a really strong sustainability capability and are doing fantastic work. I guess the area where Australia is perhaps not in keeping with the rest of the world is probably our residential sector has not been through the kind of reforms that we've seen in the UK and Germany and even North America, where there's more exposure to a cold climate, so people feel those drafts, people have higher heating bills. The cost of keeping a building warm in winter is a massive financial burden for people, so they don't have the option like we do in Australia of just dealing with the heat and turning a ceiling fan on and opening the window and going for a swim, for instance, to relieve yourself from the heat. We're kind of blessed by a mild climate, but I think that's also held us back from keeping pace with some of those changes to, better quality ventilation, introducing double glazing as standard, air tightness and sealing, some of the things that are characteristic of a passive house building. Well, those things are now standard practice in Europe and North America, whereas I think in Australian, particularly residential construction, we don't see that yet. We still see predominantly single glazing. We still see quite leaky buildings relative to the rest of the world, so that the energy that people are paying for to put into air conditioning their space is often, a large part of that is wasted by the exfiltration of that conditioned air out into the hot outside world. So I think it's a mixed story. The institutional owners, I think, have a really strong story to tell, but then that sort of middle sector and, general residential sector, middle to lower commercial sector, say the B and C grade stock, as well as the residential sector, probably still have a really long way to go relative to the rest of the world. Yeah,
awesome. And at the very high level, what excites you the most about sustainability or passive house, or anything that I guess you work on day to day in the next between now and say 2050?
Yeah, I think the idea that we could move to dramatically more efficient buildings and improve energy productivity across the Australian economy by having higher performance buildings is really exciting to me. I think there's a great 10, 15 years of work to play out to see us transition the Australian building industry into a state where that's normal. And I think that's what I really hope for, is that those low carbon, high performance, great indoor environmental quality buildings are something that all Australians get to enjoy in the near future. So I think that's what's so exciting about where we are now, is that there's this real lifting of the level of aspiration that's aligned to the zero carbon science-based targets movement to get to zero carbon and to basically save the planet from the worst effects of climate change. We all need to be doing this. So there's a really nice alignment around the sort of indoor environmental quality and comfort that we all want to feel and experience in buildings, that things like Passive House will help deliver, but also this aspiration to achieve low carbon buildings, which I think, again, Passive House and sustainability is really well positioned to deliver that energy productivity, indoor environmental quality and other sustainability outcomes. So I think that's probably what's exciting. I guess another one is that at EMP Capital, we're participating in a research trial with Sydney University. Using an Internet of Things sensor called the Samba sensor. So Samba is the Internet of Things device that measures indoor environmental quality parameters like temperature and humidity and CO2 levels, VOCs. So it really measures a broad spectrum of indoor environmental quality parameters, and it feeds that data via Internet of Things based sensor network into a cloud-based platform where you can see in real time the analytics of how am I doing in my space. And we've got that deployed across 6 buildings. We've got 10 sensors in each of these 6 buildings, and we're running that as a research trial with Sydney University. And at the same time, you run what's called BOSSA, Building Occupant Satisfaction Survey of Australia surveys, which are, if you like, the subjective questionnaire that the building user would fill out. And we pair that with the data from the Samba sensor and say, well, between the empirical data and the subjective data, how is this environment performing from an indoor environmental quality perspective? So I think that's a really good example of something we'll see more of in the sustainability space is Internet of Things enabled sensors partnered with big data, cloud-based big data analytics platforms, delivering real-time insights to property owners and building users that will help improve all of our experience in buildings.
Is there any information, or is the data thrown up anything surprising yet, or is it too early in all the research?
Well, we've been really pleasantly surprised to find that the buildings where we've installed the sensors are actually performing really well. So It's actually a great good news story that we can share with our customers, the tenants, the building users. And it's a great engagement talking point for us that, hey, we're investing in this new technology and it's a good story for both of us. And we're using it as a way of prompting a discussion around, well, can we experiment with the temperature settings? Floating seasonal set points that mean that we might run the building a little bit hotter in summer, maybe 23 or 23.5, and there might be, a 5% energy saving per half a degree or 10% per degree is the rule of thumb. So, we might benefit from an energy saving, and yet you might be more comfortable, and your building occupants might report being more comfortable at 23 than they are at 22 plus or minus 1.5, which is a traditional set point. So, I think there's a really exciting piece there that big data analytics allows us to do, to have that discussion with tenants about, well, it's adaptive comfort. We know that people dress more lightly in summer and more heavy clothing in winter, and that our buildings are typically set to one single set point throughout the year, irrespective of the clothing factor and metabolic rate of the occupants. So, it's really interesting to work with research partners like Sydney Uni to try and explore some of the ways we can make buildings more comfortable and energy efficient just through tuning and controls settings.
That sounds amazing. So that's in sustainability. What do you think will have the biggest impact on the buildings industry in general? And it doesn't really have to touch on anything we've spoken about so far.
Well, I think actually it is two of the things that we've spoken quite a lot about. I think the changes to the minimum standards, the changes to the National Construction Code over time, if the Australian Buildings Code Board were to adopt the recommendations in the ASBEC report, I think that would be transformative for the Australian built environment, both from a lived experience of all of us in buildings and from a low carbon perspective. And I think that nicely leads into the second big theme, which is the drive to zero carbon. I think it's a real mega trend that is shaping the character and the design of buildings in Australia and around the world today. It's a really interesting design challenge to identify pathways to zero carbon buildings in a relatively short time frame. 2030 is not that far away. So I think that's a fascinating challenge that we're all deeply engaged in. And as we said at the beginning, it's a combination of facade performance, external shading, glazing performance, building ceiling, thermal bridging, glass technology, building integrated photovoltaics, plus services efficiency, things like, the rollout of LEDs and, improved efficiencies we're getting on HVAC equipment, heating, ventilation, air conditioning equipment like chillers and boilers, and, the introduction of electronically controlled fans and pumps that are just much more responsive, and we can adjust them to spend more time off. And just the smarts that are going into buildings now, the state of building management systems technology, BMSs, and the ability to fine tune and optimize the performance of assets, of built assets at the moment is something that's really opening up, and a lot of energy efficiency opportunities are going to come through that as well. Yeah, you mentioned it's a trend. I think it's going to be maybe an inevitable trend, whether it's by choice or by necessity. We're going to have to head that direction, eventually. Yeah, either way. That's right. And I think there's probably a few really interesting themes to touch on in terms of sustainability drivers. Like, we're seeing more and more clients of ours who are institutional investors, say super funds, probing for what is the real sustainability performance of EMP Capital as an investment manager. And, in terms of the money that I'm giving you, AMP Capital Real Estate, how are you ensuring that that's de-risked from climate change and it's it's being deployed into green assets that are free from risk around not just climate change but supply chain risk around materials. I mean, we've seen the real prominence of the aluminium composite panels issue that's been sparked by the Grenfell fire tragedy in the UK, the proposed introduction of a Modern Slavery Act in Australia with a real focus on human rights in the supply chain of operational and buildings during construction. So, is everyone being paid a fair wage and, being treated fairly and equitably? And that's something that we, are seeing much more focus on, being driven by investors. And I guess the other aspect, we talk quite a bit about climate change mitigation, but climate change adaptation is another really strong theme in terms of the assessment of physical risk to assets and that transition risk of how do we decarbonise these assets and how well equipped is an institutional owner like AMP Capital to transition its portfolio to that zero carbon world, or are we going to be left with high carbon stranded assets whose value is affected? So that's a really interesting discussion we're starting to have with investors as well. And then I guess there's a whole theme around the customer side as well, and we consider our customers to be the building users, and so there's a really strong piece around health and wellbeing.
Hey everyone, so Chris actually just dropped out of the Skype, so you're going to hear the rest of the interview by phone, so the audio quality is a little bit different, but Chris continues talking about health and wellbeing.
There's this other component around customer satisfaction, the building user experience, where there's a lot of attention, I think, in sustainability on how the building, particularly office buildings, can support people in their aspiration to be healthier and fitter and, have a better diet. So there's some interesting stuff there around the facilities that owners like AMP Capital and others are doing in end-of-trip facilities, so putting in more bike racks, lockers, change rooms to support people to go to the gym during the day or cycle to work. And there's also some really nice stuff around biodiversity, around native planting and xeriscaping in landscapes and even beehives. We've got one, I'm a beekeeper myself at home, so we've actually now got one beehive at one of our office parks at Thomas Holt Drive in Macquarie Park. So we've got a colony out there, and we had our first harvest over the summer, and we were able to tap that off and extract it and then give 80 jars of honey away to the customers and some of our internal stakeholders in the business. So that was a really nice way that we could kind of bring sustainability home in a practical way to people. Yeah,
really cool. Amazing. Well, it's been phenomenal chatting to you, Chris. And if people want to find out more about you, and I understand there is an Australian Passive Haus Association conference coming up, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, there is. Yeah. Absolutely. So it'll be down in Melbourne, and it's the 3rd to the 7th of May, with the key days being the 4th and the 5th. It's going to be held at, it's an AMP Capital owned asset at 700 Burke Street, which is in the Docklands, which is the headquarters of the National Australia Bank. So they've kindly let us use a big auditorium facility they've got there. So thanks to NAB. And it's called the South Pacific Passive Haus Conference 2018. So if anyone's interested in attending, please do come along. It'll be a jam-packed agenda. We've got international speakers coming out from the German Passive Haus Institute to tell us about the latest thinking out of Europe. We've got case studies from around Australia and New Zealand, some great buildings being built in New Zealand and one from Western Australia that's certified to Passive Haus. There'll be some case studies on those, as well as speakers from Monash University who are doing really great work. That Monash is building a 6-storey student accommodation building to the Passive Haus standard. So Congratulations to Monash for that amazing leadership position they're taking. And there'll be all sorts of technical insights and content around things like air tightness and thermal bridging and some of the more technical details, as well as practical examples for people who might be considering building, say, a Passive Haus residential home for their family.
Sounds phenomenal. Well, I'll get down to it, and everyone listening probably definitely worth getting down to it. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Chris. That was absolutely amazing. Hey guys, Adam here. Just before you go, just one quick request. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review. It helps our rating and ranking on iTunes, so more people can hear from the people who are making our cities better places for our future.